Hey everyone, it's Asher here from Ad Hoc Politics. I wanted to jump on here and share my thoughts on Trump's most recent Truth Social post, where he seems to do kind of a 180 on the Ukraine policy. And so let's take a moment and read this post and kind of go over some of this stuff. All right, so I believe this was from the 23rd, perhaps the 24th of September 2025. Trump posts on Truth Social, quote, after getting to know and fully understand the Ukraine Russia military and economic situation, and after seeing the economic trouble it's causing Russia, I think Ukraine, with the support of the European Union, is in a position to fight and win all of Ukraine back in its original form. With time, patience, and the financial support of Europe, and in particular NATO, the original borders from where the war started is very much an option. Why not? Russia has been fighting aimlessly for 3.5 years, a war that should have taken a real military power less than a week to win. This is not distinguishing Russia. In fact, it is very much making them look like a paper tiger. When the people living in Moscow and all the great cities, towns, and districts all throughout Russia find out what is really going on with this war, the fact that it's almost impossible for them to get gasoline through the long lines that are being formed, and all the other things that are taking place in their war economy, where most of their money is being spent on fighting Ukraine, which has great spirit and only getting better, Ukraine would be able to take back their country in its original form, and, who knows, maybe even go further than that. Putin and Russia are in big economic trouble, and this is the time for Ukraine to act. In any event, I wish both countries well. We will continue to supply weapons to NATO for NATO to do what they want with. Good luck to all. Donald J. Trump, President of the United States of America. All right, so at first glance, this definitely seems like a 180 where Trump and his administration had been trying to negotiate an end to the war. We had the Alaska summit. We've had Witkoff flying over all over the damn world, setting up these meetings, and we've had Europeans coming to Washington, Zelensky coming to the Oval Office, and all of a sudden now Trump is saying, "Well, good luck," you know. So while he is saying that Russia's in big trouble and that sure Ukraine can take everything back, why not? Go all the way to Moscow. I think what's really bleeding through in this message is that he is reaching the end of his rope with this process. And there is a profound frustration, a profound cynicism, and a profound sarcasm coming through with this. And you can kind of understand why. Well, he has people within his own administration, people like General Kellogg, who I believe just last week was in Kiev accepting a Medal of Honor from Zelensky and praising Ukraine, saying that Ukraine is winning the war. And this is Trump's peace envoy to Russia and Ukraine. And so he's getting all this information from people like Kellogg, hardliners within the United States, the neocons, the warhawks, saying, oh no, the war's going great. We just need to keep holding the line, keep pursuing these same policies, and we're going to win. And it's the same with the Europeans. They don't want to give an inch. They don't want to negotiate. They just want Russia to capitulate. And so I think in this message, Trump is saying, okay, if that's what you guys think, sure, go all the way to Moscow. Why not? And at the same time, though, he's washing his hands. He's abdicating responsibility. He's putting this in the lap of the Europeans and saying that you don't want to negotiate an end to the war. You want to keep this going? Great. You've been telling me this whole time that Ukraine is winning, Russia's on its last legs, they're facing real economic trouble. Okay, what's great. I'll sit back, I'll sell weapons, we'll make money, and this is great. We're going to win the war. And so I think this is extremely sarcastic and unfortunate. Um, this is not the way you should be announcing policy decisions, that you're walking away from a conflict using these kind of deceptive and sarcastic messaging. It's not a good look, especially from somebody who's supposed to be the leader of the free world and the leader of NATO and the leader of the West. And does not feel like leadership to me. This feels like you don't want to get blamed. And so you're passing the blame on to the Europeans. And, to some extent, I can understand why. I mean, they've been fighting him every step of the way. They don't want to give an inch. And they've gone all in their narrative and their propaganda, the hysteria that they're stirring up in Europe, and saying how the Russians are going to march all the way to Warsaw, and then Berlin, and then Paris, and then Madrid. They're just going to roll over all of Europe, and that this is an existential crisis for Europe, and therefore Ukraine is holding the line against the hordes of Attila the Hun that are just the barbarians at the gates. At the same time, though, they're also saying, oh, the Russian army's completely incompetent, and they can't even take little Ukraine, a real military power like the United States, do this in a week. And so, which is it? Is Russia completely incompetent? Is their economy about to collapse? Or are they this unstoppable juggernaut? And Putin is the new Hitler who wants to roll into Europe and create a new Iron Curtain. So this messaging is just complete fucking nonsense. And I could see why Trump is fed up with the Europeans and why he would be frustrated with this kind of thinking. Or from Trump's perspective, he says over and over and over again, this is not my war. This is Joe Biden's war. This is Zelensky's war. This is the Europeans' war. This is Putin's war. This war would have never have happened if I was president. And honestly, that's probably true. But Trump, you are president. You are the president. And you ran explicitly on an anti-war platform. You said I'd have this thing over in a day, and this would be easy. And I think most reasonable people saw that as hyperbole, but he was at least going to try to end the war, as for Joe Biden never even talked to Putin after it started. Not a single time. And Trump, to his credit, has tried. But this is an unwinnable situation for him. I think, we've inherited this debacle. This is an unmitigated disaster for everyone involved, but especially for the Ukraine, and especially for Europe, and the West as a whole. This war has done real damage to the West and our position in the world. And what looked like a winning hand going into this war now doesn't look like a winner, and massively underestimated the Russians. And for their part, Putin massively underestimated Ukraine. Like he fucked up badly in this as well. He made a lot of mistakes, and so this whole thing has just been a disaster for everybody involved. But to keep this war going, this is extremely expensive, and it's severely damaging not only the economies of Europe, but also the geostrategic position, where we're chasing Russia into a corner, and the big panda is right there giving them a nice big bear hug. The two bears can get together, and China is the real beneficiary of this war. This has been a windfall for them. Not only are they getting dirt cheap energy, one of their great rivals, Russia, is now firmly in their camp, and China is just massively benefiting from their great rival Russia and their other great rival, the United States and the West and NATO, expending so much blood and treasure over this ultimately pointless fucking war. And I think Trump inheriting this mess, as a reasonable business person, is looking at this and saying, this is a complete fiasco. The reasonable thing to do would be to shut this war down. And so we're going to try to negotiate a peace. And, so we had Witkoff flying all over the goddamn world, meeting, Putin in Russia. And I think they came to terms ultimately in Moscow. And I think the Americans were prepared to accept Russia's demands. And that was the 4 oblasts and no NATO membership are the primary, root causes of this war. No NATO membership, and now that Russia has expended so much blood and treasure, they have to come out of it with these territories where a lot of the Russian-speaking people live in Ukraine. And so that was their demands. They did not budge an inch on it. And I think Trump saw that as acceptable because really, the United States has no vital strategic interests at stake here. There is, we're not an ally. We were not a treaty ally of Ukraine. They're not a part of NATO, not a part of the EU. So what if they lose the war? Ultimately, it doesn't really matter for the United States. The fucking geniuses that run our foreign policy and the CIA and the think tanks and the NGOs, the lobbyists, they came up with this grand strategic plan where we're going to use Ukraine to deliver a strategic defeat to Russia, and then we're going to have a regime change in Russia. We're going to reap all the benefits, and then, they're going to be firmly in our camp. And this plan has failed miserably. This is a fucking debacle. Not only has Russia proven to be way more resilient than we could have possibly imagined, and their economy has done way, way better than all expert analysis, it's also strengthened this entire new pole in the world that is rallying around Russia and against the West. And it's almost creating a new Cold War. And we have not been able to isolate Russia. If you look at the amount of the percentage of population that supports Russia versus who supports Ukraine, I think it's about 17% of the world's population has put sanctions on Russia, and well over 35% of the world's population is still cooperating with Russia. They're not explicitly on their side, but countries like China and India are continuing to do business with them, refusing to sanction them, refusing to condemn them, are maybe not on their side, but they're not on our side. And so this is not an isolated country. It's not an isolated economy. The sanctions war has failed miserably, and the war on the battlefield is not going any better. And it has devolved into a war of attrition. And this is a type of warfare that Russia specializes in, and they have the resources and the grit to absorb big losses. And a lot of people coming back in body bags that in the West, we would never have the stomach for this kind of thing. But Russia has proven time and time again over the centuries that this is a type of war that they can win. And they view this as an existential threat. Whether people in the West want to acknowledge that or not doesn't matter. That's how they view it. Having a hostile Ukraine that's a member of NATO on their border is simply unacceptable. And they're not going to lose this war. They're going to go all in. And they have. And they're outproducing the West, I think 4-1 in most armaments, or important armaments. And they've been able to scale up their military economy. So the sanctions aspect of this war has utterly failed, and it's devolved into a war of attrition. And both sides are just shoveling men into this meat grinder. And quite frankly, unless the West wants to send boots into the ground, wants to send their soldiers, Ukraine cannot win this war. They cannot win a war of attrition against Russia. And so this is a debacle. And Trump rightly sees this, that this is an unwinnable war, and wanted to get out of it. And so I think that he sent Witkoff there and was prepared to agree to the terms. However, he would have to sell this to the Europeans and to the Ukrainians. And he was not able to do that. He never put his foot down and said, look, this is how it is. I know that you've been telling your people, you've been stirring all this hysteria, you've been pumping propaganda out. Well, now you got to admit the truth that this is not an existential threat to the West. This is a war at our leisure that we are bleeding Ukraine dry with and using them as a battering ram to try to weaken Russia. And it's failed. The war has failed. Ukraine is not going to be able to defeat the Russian army. The Russian economy is not going to collapse. We have not been able to isolate them. In fact, we've strengthened their position. They look a lot stronger today than they did a few years ago. I'll say that. And so it makes sense that Trump would want to get out of this. But because Europe has gone all in with Zelensky and all in with Ukraine, the current leadership in Europe is unable to do that. They'd have to admit that they've been lying and that they've been propagandizing and that this war is a disaster that we are losing. And if we want to continue it, there's very little prospects of an actual victory. From Ukrainians' perspective, their explicit war games are to retake all the territory and to have a war crimes tribunal for Putin and have full, restitutions paid. The Russians will have to pay. They want like a Treaty of Versailles. They want a complete capitulation of Russia, and they're not going to do that. So we're at an impasse, and Trump is not able to convince his own minions. Ultimately, the United States is the backbone for this whole thing. Weren't able to get our guys to go along with what he wanted to do. And so I think he's just reached the end of his rope here and saying, look, well, if you're telling me that Ukraine's winning, great. Go all the way to Moscow. Don't come crying to me if it doesn't work out the way you've been saying it. And so it's just very unfortunate, but it seems like this is the end of the negotiations and that this battle's going to be solved on the field. The war is going to be solved in a military solution. And unfortunately, that's kind of the worst possible outcome. And, Ukraine is holding on. They're fighting like tigers. They've been incredibly tenacious. And you got to admire them for the courage of their people and the resilience they've been able to show in what is really a massive overmatch. And I think there's kind of this view in Europe, and especially in Ukraine, that the United States is this limitless kind of grab bag of money and military equipment. But the reality is, we have reached the bottom of the barrel for what we can give to Ukraine. There's like a 7-year list to get Patriot missile batteries now. We don't have the ability to scale up our military production. We've given everything we can. We tried everything to win this war, and we lost. And so just recognizing that and ending the war would make a lot of sense. But obviously, Trump couldn't get the rest of the crew to go along with it. So he's walking away. And he's putting the blame right in the lap of the Europeans, saying, look, I tried to end the war, couldn't get you guys to go along with it. I was willing to do these massive secondary sanctions on India and China, couldn't get you guys to go along with that either. So I've done everything I can. You want the war to keep going? Good luck. And so that's how I interpret this message from Trump. And again, this is a bad look for the leader of the free world. I don't think this is showing good leadership. I don't think announcing policy decisions should be just coated with sarcasm and cynicism like this. And it's just an unfortunate situation, but who knows? Maybe Trump will change his mind. He does that a lot. He's very unpredictable. So he could come back next week and say, okay, well, we're actually starting negotiations again. But that's where we're at today, and that's how I see things. So anyways, I hope you all have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you guys next time.